Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone, and the invitation to be back. It's fantastic being back in Qatar, and the hospitality has been amazing. So I really appreciate the opportunity to get away from New Zealand and to come back to Qatar and catch up with you all and hopefully add some value. We were trying to figure out what I could do for a Tuesday talk, and to be fair, it gets quite difficult because you look at the quality of the speakers and the people that you have through Aspetar these days. It's pretty hard to figure out what I'm a specialist in and what I could add some value in, and all of the things that I've spoken about in the past here would be hamstrings, and I definitely can't come here and talk about that anymore. Cardiac stuff, I certainly couldn't talk about that, and vitamin D, I've got no right to come and talk about that anymore. So I was starting to run out of things that I could talk about. But then I realised that actually this year I think I've been pretty heavily affected by Zika virus, like many of the people that are involved around the Olympics. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of an update on Zika, which I think is relevant, but does tend to polarise people because a lot of people would say, well, it's a bit of a nothing. I don't really know why we're worrying about it. So I did a tropical medicine diploma before I started my sports medicine. Spent 4 months in Liverpool studying tropical medicine. And Zika virus was a little wee appendum at the bottom of the page. And the reason for that was that it was known to be a flavour virus, but 80% of people were asymptomatic with it. You got all these symptoms of fever, rash, headache, muscle aches, joint aches, a bit of conjunctivitis and some headache behind your eyes. But essentially it was a mild self-limiting illness that didn't cause any problems and that no one was really interested in. So there was no research going on at all around Zika virus because it had no real consequence, and we're talking about comparisons with dengue and malaria, which are real killers. Zika just didn't rate as an issue to be on the radar. But that all changed in 2015 and 2016, and two things happened that changed that. First thing was that Zika arrived in Brazil. Brazil's got a population of about 220 million people. Many of those people live in pretty congested, lower socioeconomic class environment where the mosquito that transmits Zika is abundant, okay? And so all of a sudden Zika went rampant through Brazil. And of course this was in the period leading up to the Rio Olympics, so there was a little bit of heightened awareness. Second thing that happened in 2015 and 2016 was that suddenly there was an increase in the number of microcephaly cases, so babies being born with small brains, small heads in Brazil. And they didn't know what this was, but some of the regions, well, one of the regions that first described it would normally see about 100 microcephaly cases in a 12-month period. They described 1,500 cases in a 12-month period over 2015 and into 2016. So all of a sudden they had this epidemic of microcephaly, with massive implications for families and children, but they didn't know what was causing it. But there was a suspicion about Zika. So that was where it started, and of course in 2015 and 2016 it went wild. The media coverage, the public media went wild, the journals went wild, everybody was reporting Zika, and there was a real atmosphere of craziness around the concerns around Zika and this new epidemic that was going on, such that even in big journals people were starting to talk about this being a new phase in medical history. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of how Zika got to where it is now, and then perhaps why it's such an issue for us now. So the first thing is that Zika was first described in 1947. It was recognised in a monkey. So in the Zika forest in Uganda, they basically have a setup where they were studying a whole lot of infectious diseases. So they stick a whole lot of monkeys in cages up on the trees, and then they monitor their temperatures and see who gets sick, which monkeys get sick. They discovered this monkey got sick, but they couldn't figure out why it got sick, so they kept on pursuing that. And in 1952, they isolated the Zika virus, which was a new virus that they hadn't isolated before. And that was pretty much it. They knew that there was this new virus, it was related to dengue, it had all of these features, but no one was particularly concerned about it. Of interest, these three guys, that must have been a pretty difficult environment working in Uganda, right? You can imagine that the environment that these guys were working in to try and make this happen in 1952. But then I was reading the literature just now, and I discovered that this guy Andrew Haddo was still publishing in 2016. I thought, that's incredible. This guy published in 1952, discovered Zika, and he's still publishing in 2016. And then I discovered, oh no, it's actually not. It's AD Haddo versus AJ Haddo. And I thought, oh, it's got to be his son. And I was like, no, it's not his son. In fact, it was his grandson. Okay, so his grandson is one of the leading researchers in Zika today. And when you pursued that, I found that actually this was one of the headlines in his local newspaper, where, raised on science and family, and he saw the Zika virus coming. You think that might be a bit grandiose, but actually in 2011 he described Zika and put this out there that it was going to be a major issue moving forward for some of the reasons that we'll come to. So the Haddo family's had a big impact on Zika. And one of the things that he's been working on is figuring out where it sits, and you can see that Zika virus here is transmitted by a mosquito, the Aedes mosquito. Its host is primates, so monkeys and humans. And it sits in relationship to yellow fever, other viruses, and dengue virus, all right? So yellow fever and dengue in particular, significant killers out there. So this is what they knew about dengue in those days. Essentially, Zika, sorry, in those days. So that essentially it would sit in a monkey host. It would be transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is recognisable by its white dots on its legs, so really distinctive, pretty mean-looking mosquito. It would bite one monkey, transfer it to another monkey, and then it would continue around in the cycle. Now the problem is that the Aedes mosquito likes to live in urban populations, so it likes to live in the city, it hangs out with people all the time, and it likes to breed in small puddles of water. So any environment where there's a little puddle will actually have Aedes mosquitoes, typically. So when silly people go and hang out in the jungle or wherever you might get into contact with these, you can then get bitten by the mosquito that's been carrying a Zika virus from a monkey, and then that will start a cycle. So you can then get bitten, you can take it back to your family, the mosquito might bite you, and then they'll transmit it to someone else in your family if there's Aedes mosquitoes in the region where you live. So this, until very recently, has been the way that Aedes has been spreading Zika virus in the community. It was about mosquitoes being in your urban environment and biting one person to the next person. But essentially, with 80% of people being asymptomatic, this was a disease that people weren't worried about. But of course, the Aedes mosquito is not a benign mosquito. It carries dengue, dengue's a killer. Okay? It carries yellow fever's a killer. And it carries chikungunya, which can be a killer. And then there's Zika that just gets tagged along at the end of it. Okay? So this mosquito, which is an urban dweller, as I've mentioned, is well known as a killer, okay? And it's a really important message to understand how dangerous some of these mosquito-borne illnesses can be. And just to illustrate that, Haiti in the 1800s or in the early 1800s was a French colony. And I'm not here to bag the French in any way at all right? I never take that opportunity when I'm here. So, in 1800, this chap did a local uprising and threw the French out. Okay, they were fed up with it. They kicked the French out. But Napoleon in 1802 said, "No, enough of this. We're having that country back again." So they stormed back in, and Napoleon sent 20,000 troops back into Haiti to reclaim it. And they did do that for a couple of years. But by 1804, 17,000 of those French troops had died from mosquito-borne illnesses transmitted, predominantly yellow fever transmitted by the Aedes mosquito. And with only 3,000 troops left, they evacuated and left it to the locals. The other example is that around about 80 years later, when the Panama Canal, a strategically important position in the world for warring and transport and economics, was being built. And again, it was started to be built by the French in the 1880s. But over the next 25 years, 22,000 people died from yellow fever while they were building the Panama Canal, which is an incredible number of people. So by the turn of the century, by 1900, the French had said, "No, we can't do this, this is crazy, we're not going to do this." And the Americans came along and took up the project and finished it. And they were able to do that because of this guy here, Walter Reed, who died shortly after doing these research projects in 1900. And what he did was, because they didn't know what was causing all these deaths, they didn't know where it was coming from, so they knew that it was a viral thing, but they didn't know what it was being caused by, but they did suspect that it was being transmitted by either a mosquito or a tick or a flea or something. So what this guy did, and it's probably an experiment that you wouldn't be able to get ethical approval for these days, he built these two huts. So this is in Cuba. They went off to Cuba, the US went over to Cuba and obviously did their experiments there rather than at home. And they got a whole lot of infected mosquitoes with whatever they could do, and they stuck these mosquitoes all in one hut, and they stuck a whole lot of other bugs of like fleas and ticks and everything that made you itch in another hut. And they took 5 human volunteers, and they stuck them in each hut until they got sick. And the only place that got sick were the people that were in the mosquito hut. These guys got very irritated, but they never got sick. And so that was how they discovered that it was a mosquito-borne virus that was actually causing yellow fever and causing these deaths. As I say, pretty difficult to get that across. Now, since those days, Zika virus has spread around the world, okay, and it's basically moved east. So it's moved east from Africa through the Middle East area and the subcontinent into Indonesia, and then by 2007 it was in the Western Pacific, then French Polynesia by 2014, and then it made a leap across into Brazil in late 2014, late in 2015. And the thought at that time was that it was brought in by the Football World Cup, and there was a lot of talk around travellers coming into Brazil and bringing in the Zika virus through the Football World Cup in 2014. That's subsequently been discredited, and people don't actually believe that that's the case, and that it was just a normal part of process going on. So nowadays Zika virus is found in over 50 or 60 countries all around the world. This map's not comprehensive, and obviously it gives you a broad idea of the regions that are involved. But it's a significant influence in terms of its spread around the world. And that would have been okay, but things started to change, as I said, in 2015, when the microcephaly cases started to appear, and by November 2015, so only 12 months ago now, people started to think, actually, we wonder if Zika is what's causing the microcephaly cases, all right? And so people were starting to make this association, but there was no evidence. And like a lot of these things, the evidence-based gurus were pushing back, saying, well, you can't make this claim until there's evidence. And the epidemiologists, predominantly in Brazil, were pushing that actually, no, we believe that there is a relationship between Zika and microcephaly. And so the Brazilian doctors were starting to look at the amniotic fluid of pregnant women. They were starting to look at the serology of low-grade fevers in Brazil, and starting to get some idea of the incidence of Zika in the area. So that by the middle of 2016, no longer was it considered just to be an association or a possible relationship between the two, but actually they were comfortable. There was enough evidence to suggest that there was a direct causal relationship between Zika virus and microcephaly. And that's a huge leap for medicine, because that's never been seen before in an arbovirus. So a virus spread by a mosquito will make you sick, but it's never caused illnesses in children in vitro, in babies. So all of a sudden we had this scenario where I could come home from travel, and if I live in a country that's got an Aedes mosquito, the Aedes mosquito could bite me, transmit it to my wife, and if my wife was lucky or unlucky enough at the time to be pregnant, then the outcome could be a microcephalic baby. But at this point we were still aware that actually you needed to have the Aedes mosquitoes to be feeding that cycle, and there was no other transmission being described. Now, that in itself is a very novel illness, but it actually got worse in early 2016. There started to be rumours going around that actually, look, there's people in countries that don't have an Aedes mosquito who are starting to get Zika. And so there were lots of rumours going around, and then there were 2 or 3 case reports such as these, where actually someone who's never travelled overseas and who's never been in contact with an Aedes mosquito has now got Zika. And how can that be so? And essentially what started to happen was that people were realising that actually there's sexual transmission of the Zika virus. And that is an incredibly novel process for any arbovirus. So normally, as I've said, you'll get bitten by a mosquito, the virus will get to you, the mosquito might transmit it to someone else, and as we've seen, it can cause a microcephaly in young babies. But now actually we had a situation where through sexual transmission you could also transmit this Zika virus, which changed things completely, because that meant that I could go away to a Zika area, come back, be completely well, because 80% of people have no symptoms whatsoever. I could transmit the Zika virus to my wife, who may get pregnant, and then suffer from microcephaly in a child. And that caused huge stress and anxiety for people all around the world. And the implications of that are still being understood in terms of what that means for travel and for pregnancy all around the world. So it's a very novel condition. And that's why in the last really 12 months, the understanding and the concerns around Zika have completely changed from what it's been previously. And it was into that environment that Rio was starting to appear. Okay, so there was all of this information starting to accumulate in the beginning of 2016, and a lot of anxiety in the media about Rio, and a lot of anxiety from athletes and coaches and support staff that were heading into Rio. We're starting to get concerns about what the implications of this might be. And the media is an incredible resource or nightmare, depending on how you use it or how you see it. And there was an incredible range of reports of Zika, depending on what the newspaper decided to print on any given day. Athletes who didn't want to go to Rio were using Zika as an excuse to pull out, and the media was reporting that at face value. There were real fears being expressed by athletes because there was an uncertainty around it. And at that time, many of you might remember that a group of bioethicists, so no epidemiologists, so not a single epidemiologist, but about 200 odd bioethicists wrote an open letter to the World Health Organization and the IOC and said, look, this is crazy. You shouldn't be having the Olympics in Rio. It's absolutely wrong. People are going to die there. People are going to come back and have microcephalic babies. The risk is too high. We definitely should be cancelling the Olympics or moving it to another location. This is 3 months out from Rio. So the IOC in their wisdom just ignored that, which is fine. But they did, from the medical side, start to address it very early on. So they started to provide advice in some sort or other from January, and then again 2 or 3 other pieces of information, really about avoiding mosquito bites. And they were putting in place things like this where they were going to be spraying for mosquitoes to prevent mosquito bites. But just to illustrate the challenges that they faced, because this is Rio, this isn't somewhere else, in the letter here they say that what we're going to do is we're going to inspect every venue where the Olympics is being held every day, and we're going to make sure that there's no water anywhere. And if there's water, we're going to suck it up, and if we see any larvae in the water, we're going to take those larvae away and we're going to test them to see if they're Aedes mosquitoes. And if they're Aedes mosquitoes, we're going to test them for Zika, and we're going to know exactly what's going on. This is going to be great. We're going to sort it all out for you, and don't worry at all. The problem was that it was Rio, right? And this is the walkway between the New Zealand building and the food hall on a random day, where there was a fair amount of water being collected around Rio, and this water stayed there for at least 2.5 weeks in some form or other, because it never went away over that period. So there was no way that it was practical what was being suggested to be done, and so there was an uncertainty for us as we headed into Rio. And that uncertainty was exacerbated by the fact that we had the World Health Organization, we had the CDC in the US, the leading organisation on infectious diseases, and we had the big old New Zealand Ministry of Health all putting out their own guidelines and recommendations for Zika. And the problem is that none of these recommendations matched, so they were all different. So you could go to one website and they would tell you, well, look, you've just got to avoid sexual activity for a month after you come back, and then another site would be 2 months, and then another site would be 6 months, and if you were a male and you were asymptomatic, it would be 6 months, and if it was a male symptomatic, it would be longer. And so there was this whole range of advice that was being given. And athletes and staff who we were trying to direct and try to provide information to really didn't get a clue from the range of information that was being provided. And that was because no one actually knew. No one knew what was really going on, because it was such a new and novel illness, because it had never been a problem before. So we put out 4 separate advisories on what we thought the risks were for athletes in the lead up to Rio. But in order to do that, we had to go away and actually look at it ourselves rather than listen, rather than actually take all the information at face value that we were getting from these organisations, because they were all providing different information or different recommendations based on the same information. So we wanted to formulate our own thought. And there were a couple of key papers that came out that made us, gave us some clarity about what our approach needed to be. The first one was this paper, which was really a response to the bioethicists. The bioethicists had come out and said, look, this is a disaster year, everyone's going to get Zika and everyone's going to take it home and it's going to spread all around the world and we're all going to die. And this paper, actually using dengue fever statistics in Rio annually over the last 10 years or so, looked at what the real risk over that window of time in Rio would be. And their guesstimate, and it is a guesstimate, of what the real risk of getting Zika virus, this is just getting Zika virus while you're at the Olympics as a tourist, is anywhere from 1.8 in a million to 3.2 in 100,000. So they were expecting about 400 to 500,000 visitors to Rio over the Olympic period, which is their normal visiting numbers, okay? So you might expect a dozen or so people with Zika virus while the Games was on. So the reality was that we assessed the risk as low. So our advice was that the risk of getting Zika virus while you go to Rio is low. The problem was that at the same time, or a little bit later, this paper came out which looked at, okay, if you've got Zika virus and you're pregnant, what's your risk? Until this point, it had been felt that the risk would be about 0.1%, maybe up to 1% of people that have Zika virus while pregnant may have the risk of a microcephalic child. Problem was that this paper, which was a nice paper, showed that 29% of pregnant women, 29% of women in Rio who were pregnant had a microcephalic child. So your risk, if you were pregnant and had Zika, of having a microcephalic child was 1 in 3. Okay, 1 in 3, which is a huge number. So we had a situation where we had low risk, but the consequence is really high. And that was a difficult message to be trying to sell to people in a world where actually there's a lot of uncertainty about what the realities of this illness are. But that was the way that we started to frame the message to our athletes. So what did we do? Well, we worried a lot, okay? It was the first thing that we did. And we changed the uniform. So we changed the uniform. If you know the New Zealand team uniform, we do a lot of black, okay? Now I remember reading somewhere and hearing that, black uniforms or black things actually attract mosquitoes. So I went in January when this was first becoming a real issue and said to the boss at the New Zealand Olympic Committee, said, look, we need to change our uniform colour. And they just laughed at me. And they said, okay, that's fine, we'll consider changing it if you can find evidence that black tracksuits are going to be worse than white or grey tracksuits. So I went away, and actually the evidence is there that if you wear black, you will get more bites than if you wear white or light coloured clothing. And that's brilliant again from the 60s, because it's hard to do this research after that. They stuck people in a mosquito-borne room with cameras, and they basically put them in a whole lot of different clothing and counted the number of bites that they got, okay? And again, as I say, they did show that if you wear light clothing. So we changed our uniform. We had a lot more long sleeves and long legging clothes despite the heat. Lighter clothing, lighter colours. We also put up mosquito nets. This is from the sailing site. This isn't from the village. The village is more like this. But we put up mosquito nets over all of the athletes' beds. So that was 250 odd. We had a team size of 350. We had 250 odd athletes that we put up mosquito nets. We were really worried because the word from Rio was that this was a 5-star accommodation and that we're not allowed to drill anything in the holes in the roof or anything. Fortunately, that didn't turn out to be the case because none of the plumbing worked. The roof had holes in it already, and nothing was right. So we were able to just drill a hole in all the roofs and stick up mosquito nets for all of the athletes. We didn't worry about the staff, we didn't worry about them quite so much. All of the athletes had education on arrival, so every athlete got educated on 2 or 3 topics, one of which was Zika and mosquito-borne illnesses. And that was a really important message, and every athlete was provided with an abundant range of mosquito repellent and education, as I say, about the whole thing. We also worked with the New Zealand Ministry of Health to be able to provide people with testing when they returned. So we had a plan when we went to Rio about what people could do if they were worried about it when they returned to get tested. And while we were there, we caught as many mosquitoes as we possibly could, because there was this real thought that we were on the 10th to the 18th floors of a building, and there was a real thought that actually mosquitoes don't go that high. They only actually fly to about 3 or 4 metres. That's their range. And it was fantastic because I caught this mosquito in the lift heading up to the 18th floor, and in fact they were all over the 18th floor where we were, so it didn't matter. But in fact, while there were a lot of culicine mosquitoes there, we didn't see any Aedes mosquitoes. The problem is that they're now thinking that maybe these mosquitoes are transmitting Zika as well in Brazil, because actually the rate of transmission has been so high. So, but we didn't see any Aedes mosquitoes there, which was nice. So what did we find? What did we do? Well, here's just some numbers of what we did with regard to Zika when we were in Rio. So we had one team member that decided not to go. And in fact, it was probably 2 or more, but there was one that I could lock in and say it was definitely because of Zika that she didn't go, and that was because she fell pregnant immediately 6 weeks before the games, and so she withdrew her availability to the team. We had 77 people in the team who were interested in understanding more about Zika while they were there. So these were people, we sent an email out and these ones came back to us and said, yeah, we want to know more about it. I did 64 consultations in the last 2.5 days, because everybody came in the last 2.5 days, about Zika. People wanting to know more about it. And the reason that I did them was that it's a really challenging message to make sure that we're delivering a consistent message and the same information, and that people are understanding and grasping what it means implication-wise in terms of having children on return from the Olympics. 9 didn't follow up and 7 elected not to be tested after they'd gone through the consultation process. So what did we do? Well, we had 29 people had a single serology test, and this is where it got interesting. So we agreed with the Ministry of Health before we went there that, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do serology, so we're going to test your blood to see whether you've been exposed to the virus. That's good. And then they said, but to be really sure, we should do a PCR and check to see if you've actually got the virus as well. And you can do that in semen, you can do that in urine, you can do it in blood. When I came back to them after Rio and said, yeah, look, we've got 60-odd people that want to do all of that, they said, no, we're not doing that. That's not going to happen. And the problem was that I'd already given all of these people the referral forms and told them what we were going to do and everything like that. And so the Ministry of Health reneged on that. We then had to go back and explain to all of those 64 people what we were now doing. And so some people that got back early managed to have 2 tests and a serology, and other people that arrived late. So it was a complete shambles when we got back, unfortunately. So 29 had a single serology test. 14 people had 2 or more serology tests. Remember that that's about looking for how your body's reaction to Zika, whether you've been exposed. And 13 had PCR testing either in the blood, urine, or in the semen. And what did we find? Well, that's a big 0. So we found 0 exposure, 0 serology from Zika virus while we were there. Now, interestingly, we had 2 chikungunyas for serology positive. We had 2 dengues positive in serology, none of which had any symptoms at all, and we think that that was probably cross-reactivity, which is one of the challenges with identifying Zika, is that the testing is not perfect. So is it an issue in New Zealand? Well, here's some of our data from the Ministry of Health in New Zealand. So in the last 12 months, there's been 45 childbearing age women diagnosed with Zika in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand doesn't have the Aedes mosquito, so we can't transmit it once it gets back to New Zealand other than through sexual transmission. But if you go off to the islands, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, which is where most of these people have been infected from, and bring it back, then your risk is real. And overall, there's 100 people in New Zealand over the last month, which in terms of public health is a small number, but in terms of implications for childbearing women, it can be quite significant. So what is the current situation and advice for travellers? So just 2 more slides for you. First message that we give people is that we don't fully understand Zika. And it's been a really interesting process, because when I say that to people, I say, look, we don't really fully understand Zika, and they say, well, can I talk to someone who does? Right? And you're like, well, actually, no, we, a global, universal we, don't understand Zika. And I say, oh, that can't be right. There's been a real challenge having an acceptance from people of uncertainty and unknown. And it's been a really interesting learning curve about how to actually deal with uncertainty. In athletes who deal with uncertainty all the time, it's part of their day-to-day sporting world. But in this environment, medicine is expected to be able to give answers, and it was very challenging. In most individuals, it's a mild self-limiting illness. Has an incubation of between 2 and 7 days. It'll last between a week and 10 days. You might get a little bit of a rash, a bit of a headache, mild fever, less than 38 temperature fever. So not much at all. The problem is that 80%, so 8 out of 10 people won't have any symptoms at all. And those people are still potentially going to transmit Zika virus onto others. So it is a consideration in childbearing individuals. So while there's still this thing that, oh, look, it's not much of an illness, this implication for microcephaly is significant. And it's important to understand that the symptoms aren't a guide, right? So this is the problem. So you go off to a Zika area where there's Zika, and you come back and you're completely asymptomatic. Well, you can still have Zika. If you fall pregnant or you transmit it to your partner who falls pregnant, then actually there's still a risk. It's that exposure that is the problem. So prevention is the key. So when you're travelling with teams or when you're travelling yourselves, it's important to understand where Zika is, particularly if you're in a childbearing age. Because post-exposure testing isn't perfect. given that 80% of people are asymptomatic, it's really difficult for them to figure out what the meaning behind the tests that they do are. So if you get a negative test but you're asymptomatic and you're 3 weeks post-exposure, what does that actually mean? They're still trying to figure out what the actual implications of the testing are, and it's definitely not perfect. And the advice at the moment is that if you've been exposed to Zika, and that just means going to Rio, for example, then you should avoid pregnancy or getting your partner pregnant for 6 months. So that's the New Zealand advice at the moment, whether you're symptomatic or asymptomatic. Now, for women, while we were in Rio, that advice went from 2 months, which for most women was not a major issue, to 6 months, which for a lot of women was a major issue, because these are women that have in often circumstances put their lives on hold for this Olympic Games, want to come home and start having a family. And so that was very challenging, particularly in light of the lack of evidence out there. And the 6 months is a little bit of a random number. I mean, 5 months and 29 days, is that different to 6 months and 1 day, right? I mean, we don't really know. And it is a challenge for those countries with the Aedes mosquito and other breeds. But there was an interesting paper that looked at, okay, what is the risk of spreading this around the world from going to Rio for the Olympic Games? And actually the risk was very low, because there's so many countries that have already got it that most countries that are at risk of having it spread within their country are already getting exposed through huge amounts of travel to other countries. And so the incidental additional travel to Rio was of minor consequence. So to summarise, it is an emerging and unique infection. It is something that it's worth knowing about and understanding. It's widespread now, but we don't know whether what's going on in Rio is also going on in other parts of the world. And the reason that it was picked up in Rio is because of the population and because of the density of population. There is a significant consequence for families and the future of families from Zika, and that's an important message that people are aware of. The consequence of this can be very significant. There is exponentially available information. Over the last 9 months, it's absolutely exploded. I don't know how people are publishing so much on this topic, but there are case reports. Everything is being fast-tracked with minimal review. So you do have to be a little bit careful when you read stuff, because there's a lot of reactive things going on and people are interpreting things very quickly. But it is an important, that's my final message really, is to understand Zika and what the implications of it might be when you're travelling with teams and travelling for yourself, because it is widespread and the implications can be quite significant. A lot of people will just choose to ignore it, and that's probably going to be okay most of the time until it's not, and then the consequence is massive. So, thanks.